Returning now to our special show on the rise of terrorism. What is the history of homegrown terrorism in Canada? Sun News contributor John Robson joins us with more from Ottawa. Hey, John, great to see you. I don't think we've ever faced such a sustained, broad wave of terrorism, but we have had terrorist incidents going back more than a century.
Yes, Canada has seen a number of terrorist incidents, and very famously we had the assassination of Darcy McGee, for which Fenian was quickly convicted and hanged, although there are some people who feel that the trial was not a particularly fair process. And we also had the parliamentary fire in 1916, which was widely thought to have been German sabotage. The Times certainly lent itself to that sort of theory, although it appears to have been someone carelessly discarding a cigar butt, which is not a particularly dramatic way to lose your parliament building. Canada has also seen some acts of terrorism that have been foreign disputes playing out in a very limited way on our soil. There were a number of attacks on Cuban government targets after the Castro takeover, but they were, not any kind of integral threat to the fabric of Canadian society. They were sporadic, they were not particularly dangerous, and there have been other quarrels of that sort that have spilled over, but again, have been of no really fundamental importance to us. Of course, we have seen one very serious incident, which was the Air India bombing. And while that, people might look at it and say, well, this was an argument about things in India and it involved Indians. But in fact, the vast majority of the dead on that plane were Canadians. And so this was not a sustained, there have been other violent incidents connected with that, India's domestic politics, but this one, certainly in terms of casualties, the most dead. But the other one that we have had that is by no means trivial was the FLQ. People tend to forget this, that for the FLQ, from a period from 1963 through 1969, leading up to the October crisis, was setting off something like a bomb every 10 days. They killed a number of people. They killed 3 people in bombings, they killed 2 more in a botched robbery, and then they murdered Pierre Laporte. And that one was a really dangerous one because there was substantial sympathy within certain segments of Canadian society to a group that was, if you read their manifestos and listen to their excuses for their killings now, it's bizarre. It's so sinister, but it's also so grotesque, this 1960s hippie Marxist rhetoric that you struggle to remind yourself that people here and abroad, like the Red Brigades and the Bader-Meinhof gang, really killed people on the basis of this kind of language. And that went on for a long time, and they didn't care when they killed innocent people. They said, well, it's your fault. They killed francophones who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. One guy, they said, oh, well, we killed the English-speaking guy, and in fact, the victim was a soldier who was bilingual and had a French-Canadian mother. But I think after the murder of Pierre Laporte in particular, there was something so cold-blooded about it that the vast majority, even of Quebec separatists at that point, turned firmly against them. And the high tide of 60s craziness was receding anyway. And so that was a problem that at one time seemed quite serious. It did lead to Pierre Trudeau invoking the War Measures Act, but eventually it atrophied. Separatism became, we may ridicule it, but it is, with rare exceptions, an entirely peaceful and democratic movement at this point. But then we start to get the specter of Islamic terrorism, and that is one that is on a scale, it has not yet reached the level, of course, of the FLQ terror. It has not gone on as long. The FLQ people count something like 160 violent incidents, and we're nowhere near that. But we certainly have had a couple of close calls. Obviously, Ahmad Rassam, who wanted to blow up Los Angeles airport. And this was a classic case because he came here with a fake passport. He was caught at the airport, immediately said, yeah, okay, but I was a victim of persecution in Algeria. I want refugee status. He went on welfare. He told a variety of tall tales. Finally, his application was turned down and a warrant was issued for his arrest, at which point he was in Afghanistan getting terrorist training. Then he came back here, and he was only eventually caught because a border guard thought he was acting hinky, which isn't even a word, but it certainly is a sound instinct. But then we've had these other incidents. Of course, we've had the Toronto 18. We've had this gathering sense that the jihad is a global movement, and if you have immigrants from places where this sort of thing is popular, you are going to have within your immigrant population a small but dangerous number of people who not only will go abroad. A number of Canadians have gone off to fight on behalf of Daesh in Iraq, ISIS as they're also known, but that you're going to get trouble here. And we have with the Toronto 18, who luckily were as inept as they were sinister, but these things keep coming up. And of course, we've had Michel Bibot, who actually shot and killed a Canadian soldier who was doing an honorable duty at the War Memorial. So we have another situation like the FLQ where we don't just have acts of violence, but we have people who have at least some kind of sympathetic base within the civilian population. And that's what can make things like this really dangerous.
Incredible. And I have a terrible feeling that unlike the Quebec separatists, there is not a courage to speak out against Islamic terrorism for fear of being called Islamophobic. I mean, Pierre Trudeau made it a point of strength, and his war against the FLQ, I think he probably went too far in suspending civil liberties and bringing in martial law, but he certainly didn't shy away from it. In fact, it was a sign, a moment for him to show his virility, his patriotism, his military might. I don't see that same confidence in even speaking the proper name of Islamic terrorism for fear of being called politically incorrect. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that there is a considerable reluctance at this point, but again, it's interesting when you talk about Pierre Trudeau because he had spent his youth in the kind of left-wing fringes of Quebec society, and he knew these people, and he knew what they were. And when he invoked the War Measures Act, I think a lot of people were sobered up in this odd way where they went, okay, this is what the FLQ has been trying to provoke all along. They want to force the Canadian government into this kind of action. And if we don't somehow stop them some other way, by ostracism, by reporting to the police if we think people have drifted into their cells, this is really going to happen. That this is not a game. That they really might provoke exactly what they want, and we will all be enormous losers by it. And I think Quebecers also felt ashamed. What we haven't had in Canada yet is significant casualties from acts of Islamist terror. And if you get that, I think you'll find that the mood, even in a world that has changed in some ways, has become, I think, genuinely and in an appropriate way more tolerant, but also has become spineless in the kind of way that we were in the 1930s. But again, you look at the radical chic in the 1960s, the extent to which people were willing to excuse that kind of thing. I mean, we forget in the late 60s, the United States had thousands of domestic bombings, most of them non-lethal. But there was the hardcore, the weathermen, that kind of thing was out there. And for a while, it seemed kind of cool to say, well, yes, power to the people. And then it dawned on more and more people across the spectrum that this was a genuine threat to good society. And I think if we start to see mass casualties, I think you'll find people much more willing to speak out.
Well, what a terrible prophecy that is. I think you're right. I hope you're right that we'll speak out. I hope we don't have the terrible casualties. First, John Robson, great to have you on the show. Thank you for your thoughts.